Hey everyone, welcome to Frontend First, podcast about modern web development. We are front-end developers. We're actually back-end developers. Contrary to popular belief, we run the whole stack. And we have an old episode about why we named it Frontend First. But anyways, that's not what we're going to talk about today. Today we are going to talk about opinionated frameworks and what a full stack or a framework really is. And we wanted to talk about this because a couple months ago, I gave a talk at Big Sky DevCon about high floor, high ceiling frameworks and libraries and front-end communities and back-end communities. And we just wanted to have a quick discussion about some of the response to that. So one of the most common things that I heard at the conference when I was talking with folks there was, okay, you showed some slides with Ruby on Rails, which was like my back-end framework of choice to demo. And you said, it's so cool because Rails can send emails, Rails can run background jobs, Rails can save data to a database with an ORM adapter-like thing. And this gives it the cohesion. And what I meant by that was all of these components know about each other. And one benefit of that, there's many benefits, but one that I highlighted was that you can write a test. Rails also comes with a testing framework and setup and harness and everything. And you can test that. You can visit your web page, sign up for an account. You can validate that the user made it into the database, that they show up in the header on the home screen, that they actually get a welcome email, that the welcome email is queued in the job system, and that hello first name, dollar first name in the email matches the first name that ended up in the database. And I thought this is like a particularly good example of the kind of cohesion that you get when your framework knows about all these parts. And one of the pieces of feedback I got, or something that people said, was, okay, that's all well and good, but what if I have a different need for my data layer? What if I want to use ConvertKit to send my emails? What if I want to use this new fancy thing to do my job system, my background jobs, or I want to try out cron, this service? And so isn't there a tension here between having cohesion and having these parts know about each other and being able to experiment with new tech?
Question. Yeah, cool. That was great. Is they're worried about being like locked into Rails, like basically like this fear, like Rails is going to get like left in the past and I'm not going to be able to upgrade. Is that kind of the concern?
I think it's some of that. It's some rumblings that they've heard of, like maybe the default stack not being able to scale, or it's not going to fit with their organization or their needs. And so, yeah, Rails is great if you just do everything it says, but if you don't, then like we have nowhere to go. And like maybe I guess the Steelman version of this would be, we have old apps that are built with older technologies or more opinionated stacks at my company. And I wish I could just like swap in Tailwind to use for styling. But like this old tool has prescribed something for styling. And so now I can't. So I'm never going to choose a tool like that again. And I think that's like the hardest, that's like the charitable way to express this argument. And so we wanted to talk about that because I don't necessarily think that's not really how I think about it. And so I wanted to kind of just, have a conversation about that.
Cool. So what would your response to that be? Like,
so at a high level, my response is, I think like everything in software, there's a continuum here. And, you might have heard the phrase, there's no silver bullet. It's true that the more restricted you make an interface of anything, the less flexible it is. And so it is true that if you're using a tool that prescribes something and you want to swap something else out, it might be harder to do that than if you put those tools together. But that's like one extreme side of the continuum. I think there's a middle ground here. The other extreme would be like the front-end communities, which is like plug and play everything. And I think there's a middle ground here, which the modern server-first frameworks like a Laravel, like a Rails, hit well, which is they have opinions about the boundaries, but the actual implementation of each service, each component of the framework can be swapped in and out. So to make this concrete, in my example, I showed off, Active Mailer, which is one of these components included in Rails, and you use APIs from Rails, imported from Rails to do things like send an email. But if you've never used Rails before, you might think, oh, okay, well, so now my Rails app is sending an email. But that's actually not the case. The Action Mailer is an interface. You can think of it like an adapter. You might have heard of the adapter pattern before in programming. And the adapter is really what is part of Rails. It's that interface of what most or all Rails apps need to do when interacting with email. But there's a configuration option where you get to config the actual sender that you want to use, the service or the sender. And Rails developers don't use their app server to send emails because
yeah, you can't. I mean, you can't send email from your server because all the big mail providers are just going to reject it because they're not going to know who your server is. So you have to use some service to send these things.
So you can configure the Amazon one. I always forget the name. It has an S in it. SES?
SES.
Yeah.
Well, what the interesting thing is in our Rails projects, we use all email basically boils down to this protocol SMTP, which is you can think of it like HTTP, but for sending email. And we use Amazon to send our emails with SES, but the way that Rails talks to SES is through SMTP. So we just configure the Rails config in production. I have the AWS SMTP addresses, which we had set up in the AWS console. But like, as you're pointing out, the beauty of this is we're using another service, but Rails, we're going through Rails config. And that allows us, like when we're writing tests, for Rails to know that we're sending out an email, and then it's not going to actually talk to Amazon when we're in testing mode. It's going to have basically a list of all the emails that was sent during every test. So you can do something like sign up a user, make sure there was one email sent, make sure it was sent to so-and-so. So it really is like kind of it shows how you can use external services, and Rails is it's exactly what you said. It's the adapter, it's that configuration.
Right. It's kind of like the best of both worlds. And the thing you have to have confidence in is that the design of that interface, that boundary, that thing that's included in the framework is going to be sufficient for your needs. Because if you needed to do something like send in 10 minutes or send tomorrow, and you couldn't do that, maybe then you're going to hit like a ceiling in this case on the back end side and feel like, okay, it's not going to work for me. I have to leave. And maybe like in the very early days, there was a lot of pieces that people felt like they had to do that, and they were, framework fighting. But again, these days, these frameworks like Laravel and Rails are so battle tested. They're so well thought out that they really include things probably 80% of which you'll never need. But when you do, it's nice that they're there. And the 20% that you use in every project are things you have to set up all the time anyways. So exactly like you said, the beauty of this is that, if folks have only ever set up, a React app and then used a service like ConvertKit or anything these days and just wired up an API endpoint to talk to that, to send the email, and that's all you've ever done, it's pretty illuminating to go through the Rails tutorial, send an email, and see what happens when you're running it in development. I mean, when you sign up the user and you're in development, Rails knows you're in development. Again, your code doesn't change. The code says, mailer send now or whatever. And it's going to pop it open in a browser and render an HTML or text email in your browser. And then when you write a test, you can assert against that UI, just like you might be used to doing with something like Puppeteer, which is incredible. And so I wanted to talk about this because I think right now the front-end frameworks sit so far on one end of the spectrum. In the past, maybe there were frameworks that sat far on the other side. And DHH even talked about this in the early days of Rails. He had a a blog post called Rails is Omakase. And this was like a popular saying in the Rails communities. And omakase, if you don't know, is like a style of sushi cuisine where the chef picks all of your food for you. And so when you go to an omakase sushi restaurant, you don't get any choices. You're having the chef's selection. And so you don't get to make any choices. And DHH's point was that, Rails is extracted from how they work at Basecamp. It's really built to serve their needs, but he's sharing it and it's open source. So it's going to be serving other people's needs. But ultimately, if you're going to build an app with Rails, you need some level of philosophical alignment with how he thinks about building software. And if you just try to use Rails on your own, in your own way, and go against, you don't agree with some of the conventions and philosophies they have, it's not the right tool for you.
Yeah, you're gonna hate it.
You're gonna hate it.
It's interesting. So you said that JavaScript frameworks sit far away on one end of the spectrum, and so we can take the email case, which we just talked about, and yeah, for email, like email hasn't changed in 30 years. SMTP has been around forever. Apps send email. That's where probably email HTML probably hasn't changed in 30 years.
Yeah, sadly.
But so it's easy to put a stake in the ground there and say that okay, we're going to support email, we're going to support all these things, and it's going to be great. And you shouldn't have to wire this up yourself. But then there's other stuff that does change. API formats, data fetching, these kind of things that front-end developers have to deal with. So I'm trying to I'm coming at this as someone that's very pro Rails, and I even think you should I think there's so much you get from using Rails. You should just buy into Rails. But I do see that there's on the email case, it's basically, well, what happens if I start using this framework and start sending emails, and then in 2 years from now, email is no longer the main method of communication? And we would laugh. We would say that's ridiculous. But there are things in JavaScript where that is the case. GraphQL is super popular now. People are telling me not to use GraphQL, and I've just adopted this whole architecture. So it does feel I don't know how to square these two things, but it does feel like if you pick examples like email that don't ever change, it's really, really easy for us to say, just use a framework, just pick a framework.
Yeah, but even in spite of the email example, we don't have a React framework that has an included mailer boundary, a mailer adapter.
That's really interesting because in Build UI, our website, we send a lot of emails, a lot of transactional emails. So when you sign up, we send you a link to activate your account to get in there and set a password. If your boss buys a subscription for you, we send multiple emails, one to boss buys a course for you. Mm-hmm. We send an email to the boss, email to you to activate your account, and all this stuff. And I took a lot of, there was nothing to do this. So I made a bunch of React components to basically preview the emails so that I could work on the email and get live reload. And I took all that inspiration from what was my Ruby on Rails workflow. Mm-hmm. But I did have to invent that myself, and I really wish I didn't have to.
Yeah, exactly. So I think I guess just to finish the story, in the early days, this Omakase thing was important part of Rails, and DHH kind of crusading his framework and trying to highlight the benefits and saying, yeah, there's cost, you can't use whatever you want, but if you buy in, you're going to be productive. You're going to start on the 20th floor. And over time, there was more configuration options that were exposed. And you could bring in more things that maybe DHH wouldn't use or a typical Rails developer wouldn't use out the gate. The testing, what was the big debate between the testing frameworks?
RSpec and mini test.
Yeah, and there wasn't a way to change those at one point. And even Yehuda with the ERB, whatever he wrote to do templating, that ended up getting merged in. There was a time where it was very inflexible, again on the other side of the spectrum, but over time you can take an opinionated framework and make it more flexible, or you can take an unopinionated framework and try to make it more flexible. But what I've noticed is that the unopinionated frameworks tend to get married to this idea that they work with anything. And
Yeah.
again, people like us who have come from frameworks that are more opinionated and cohesive, we actually don't like that. That's not a feature. That's a bug because,
Yeah.
you know, every app is not a snowflake. We're all basically doing the same thing. Glorified views of Excel spreadsheets. Someone said one time. It's basically true. Database views, right? And a lot of people would benefit from having more guide rails to help them, you know, do the things in the right pattern, fall into a pit of success, and not have to reinvent all this stuff like you did. And even if you can do it because you're using a reference point from an opinionated framework, it's still a lot of work. So
No, you're. I want to hit on this. When you have a big app that's flexible and it works with everything, you're not working in a flexible code base. You're making your own framework.
right.
And
Absolutely.
yeah,
Absolutely. We've seen that so many times. And it's just an undocumented framework that has no like upgrade path, and it has different versions of the framework and different pages because the conventions and the code reuse that you do aren't, you know, shared and battle tested like they are in an open source framework. So
you know what's interesting there is that like maybe if you're a solo developer or you're doing like side projects, maybe that's totally fine because you're not going to be upgrading a lot and like your goal is to like try a lot of new tech. But I think this when you're trying to get patterns that like are spread across a big team, not even a big team, but even like a team of 10 people, 20 people, I think this stuff like really starts to matter. And when you have all this fragmentation of like 20 ways to do something, it gets really rough anyway.
yeah, it definitely does. So kind of just coming back to that feedback, you know, I think that my main reason of wanting to talk about this on the podcast is to emphasize first that if you've only ever used like a cohesive batteries included framework and felt like you hit a bunch of limitations and you couldn't use Tailwind to style things, or you couldn't bring in some library that you wanted to use and you felt like, oh man, it's just like you're out of luck. I think they've gotten a lot better, or I think there's better frameworks that accommodate a lot of that kind of experimentation while still giving you these adapters. The second point I want to make is just that I think when I said in the second part of my talk that one of the things that the front end community could learn most from the back end community is cohesion, I was talking about this adapter idea, this idea of, again, something like a mail, active mailer, a mailer interface. Can you ever imagine that being included in, you know, a Next.js or a Remix? It's hard to imagine right now. Although like the image component in Next is actually a good example of them like saying the image component, actually, if you are a Next developer, the image component, regardless of what you think about it, it actually is exactly an example of this adapter pattern. Because if you go to the Next docs and you say, how do I render an image? They're going to tell you to use the image component from Next. And if your images are served on Cloudinary or something else, ImageX, you can actually configure that in the config. But the image component will do common things that a lot of people need to do with images, like preload them if they're above the fold, like render different sizes for different screen sizes. They can optimize them differently based on the pixel ratio of the device, the screen that you're viewing them. Those are the kinds of things that, you know, are important to front-end developers or folks who think about performance. And it's actually really good that they're working on including those things and bundling those things in with an interface. That doesn't mean you have to use Vercel to host your images, right? You can still use Cloudinary or ImageX. So I think that's a really good example of the kind of thing that front-end frameworks could do more of. And again, if you think about having an interface for mailers, for job queues, for all these things, for authentication, and they all can speak to each other, that's what the examples were supposed to show, and they unlock a lot of powerful expressive APIs that let you get a lot done really quick. I think it's been interesting watching the front end community in the last 10 years and the kinds of things we've experimented with. React is so powerful and so fun to use. It makes its way into like almost every organization. And there is the least common denominator of React at any company is like a React component and the ability to like make a fetch call when you click a button or render. And so you see all of these new services that are experimenting with, like you said, GraphQL in the back end, or resend for emails, or a service that does cron jobs, or an AI endpoint that lets you stream AI responses into your app. And so those companies want to integrate in a way that can work for any React app. And so it's like the lowest common denominator is an API endpoint. And so all the frameworks say, well, yeah, you can use an API endpoint, you can use any service, you can use anything because you can make an API request. But I think, again, what I just want to highlight here is that if we stick at that lowest common denominator and we never have frameworks experimenting with adapters and interfaces that are higher level and more expressive, we lose out on the benefits of the cohesion. And I think there's nice middle grounds where I would like to see the front end community experiment with. It doesn't mean everyone has to use the same component library or a CSS framework because the adapter pattern exists basically. And there's a lot of precedent in frameworks like Laravel and Rails that could get us very far just by copying it,
Yeah. Yeah, that was great. When you're talking about things that, like this adapter pattern, immediately that comes to mind is something like composition. And something like radix, we often look at radix as like our kind of North Star, our shining star of composition. Radix doesn't have to use a service. It's just React components. Those compose well. So I don't know. I have this like half-formed thought, but like composition definitely works in React. And maybe the limiting factor is what you're saying, that like the lowest common denominator is a component and therefore everything just works over fetch. But I don't know. I guess like my question, my half-formed thought is like the fact that Radix works and Radix is so popular. When I say Radix works, I mean Radix is so successful, it's so popular. Does that show that like there is this future where like React developers aren't opposed to composition? They're not opposed to interfaces and wiring things together.
Yeah, I'm really glad you asked that because it reminded me of a pretty interesting conversation I had at Big Sky. I forget who it was with, but so let's take the Radix case. So the Radix case is interesting, and this goes for any like headless UI library. I think at this point, most developers like to use headless libraries like Radix or React Aria or headless UI for doing something like a drop down because they get all the behavior, but then they can style it however they want. This is very interesting because if you go back to Bootstrap, you had a Rails app or even a React app and you need a drop down. So you install Bootstrap and it brings the styling and the behavior. And people ran against ceilings all the time with Bootstrap. It didn't look like their app did. They wanted extra functionality that it didn't have. And so it was a one-way door, in and out, right?
Yeah.
And so you might say, all we need is like better UI libraries, or we need like a Bootstrap that has like everything. Or like Rails needs an adapter that is how every Rails developer renders like a form. And then now we can swap out Bootstrap for Material or something like that. So that's kind of like this thinking of the adapter pattern for solving that problem of hitting a ceiling. But it turns out, and I agree with what you're saying here, that there was an approach with that uses composition to kind of disentangle the pieces that people wanted to change from the pieces that everyone wanted, which is the behavior. And it actually surprisingly turned out that something like Radix or React Aria was all we needed. And that solved that problem, because if you use a headless UI library, you never run up against the ceiling in terms of the styling, because it doesn't provide styling. So I was talking about this at Big Sky, and I was saying, back when we were using Bootstrap and Material came out, and you're like, okay, do I use one or the other? No one could have really predicted. I mean, I'm confident in saying no one could have predicted that the actual solution here, the way we'd be building things in 10 years, is actually just sharing the behavior of something like a tab list or a drop down or a modal with click away to close. And the styling is going to be separate. You can use a pre-styled version. You can use your own. You can style it however you want. So
100% agree.
So that's pretty fascinating. And I don't think it is necessarily a contradiction against this idea of cohesion, because the behavior is what is being shared. And we still have a cohesion in the sense that if you open up a React app today, it's likely that we're going to be using shared code that is battle tested. That's really the whole point of this, right? So we were talking about this in the context of server components and server actions. And, I kind of just like asked this open-ended question, which was, maybe instead of an adapter for email, the way that services and frameworks in the front-end ecosystem are going to give us shared code that we can use to have more cohesive code bases is in the form of components that decompose. And you can imagine like a headless sign-in component that you can, again, like the image component, right? You could imagine an image component that is not tied to Next, but is effectively something like a radix library that everyone ends up using because, again, it's battle tested. It papers over the parts of the APIs that are difficult in the browser, etc. So that was getting me excited thinking about that, because the React community has some really awesome advanced composition patterns. And if server components and server actions become widespread, then the ways that we solve all of this maximal flexibility and all this complication wiring these things up could look very different than it did in Rails.
Yeah. Also, just taking it back to how we started this conversation, the lowest common denominator in all React apps is a component. And so if you did have headless components for sending email, I know I can get those in my app. Like, I don't know what it's going to look like, but I know that components are easy to slot into apps.
And then if the lowest common denominator is a server component, if you can make an assumption, if server components become, widely used, and kind of that's something that that's a higher lowest common denominator. And so you could have even more functionality. And so,
absolutely. In my example, I am saying that like it's a given that like you're using React, you're using server components,
right?
And you're
right.
I know that not everyone will, but yes, that's.
So then you could imagine, maybe the way that you write a test that tests all these different things is, the test is rendering like a headless sign-in component, and it's using. I'm not sure what it would look like to do the data persistence, but you could imagine something, whatever a Prisma-like thing packaged up at, I'm not really sure if it would be like a server action around it or a component that fetches data. Point being, if you have a layer of abstraction, then you can configure, in production, we're going to use this database. In development, we'll use SQLite. Again, this was something else I wanted to say earlier. We use the mail example, but in Rails, again, the way you interact with your data is through all the Rails active record APIs. In development, you're talking to an SQLite database. In production, you can swap those things out. So again, Rails moved from Omakase to more configuration options, and that solved a lot of the problems that people had with it. And components could solve a lot of that. I still think there's a room for someone with like taste and opinions to put them together, because even if we had server components, let's say we had something like a next auth library that everybody in React used, because once you have server components, there's just like a very universal, like Devise was in Rails, basically. You had something like that that could render a login form, and it keeps all the autocompletes up to date, and it does all that gnarly stuff. You configure it with how you want to save the user, get the token, whatever. And I still think there's room for someone to build a story that can do that, in development and testing and put those together. So I think there'll always be room for a framework, even if the building blocks become like bigger Lego pieces. But it definitely could look very different.
Wait, I think hold on, let me unpack that. So you're saying that things like Radix can get popular without becoming their own framework. They can just be a library. But you still think there's room for, okay, I'm just getting this. You still think there's room for frameworks because frameworks can package these really big pieces together, and that, just like Rails does, that's where the cohesion comes in.
Exactly. I'm trying to think of an analogy in Rails where like something that used to be part of Rails eventually was just like delegated out. It was like outsourced. Maybe it's
usually the other way.
Yeah, I know. Maybe they had like a custom WebSocket implementation, and there was a bunch of code that someone had to write on the Rails team to do that. And then like Socket.io came out, or like WebSockets became a standard in browsers. And they were able to drop all that code. But again, there's still a room for a tasteful adapter interface for how a typical Rails app should interact with WebSockets and receive updates. That is still comprehended by the other pieces like the testing harness and all that stuff. So I think, I think
the job stuff is pretty good. So like people doing Rails had been doing background jobs, and it was kind of up to you. You find a library, a gem that supports it, and you install it. And then, a couple of years later, Rails builds job support directly into the framework, but it still works with all the popular libraries. So you don't have to throw everything away,
Right.
Yeah.
Absolutely. I just thought of one interest, because we are always like, we should make a framework, and then like it's like 1 millisecond later and we're like, nah. But just for fun. I mean, well, you actually did make a framework for fun, but I've always wanted, like, if AI could just say, like, I would say, like, what does Rails look like in modern React? Just the interfaces, just like the TypeScript interfaces, like literally, and just see what it would look like. One way someone could experiment with building a front-end framework that's opinionated would be to like define basically things like the image component interface that's next, but let you swap things out. So if you had like a sign in, a sign out, if you had, in Q job, right, there'll be some JavaScript APIs in there that you call imperatively, send later. But again, maybe eventually those become some declarative reactism. Again, we didn't know that hooks were going to exist and that we would be able to share something like use measure. We always thought that that was going to be imperative code that you had to write, but React gave us a primitive that let us wrap it in a shareable declarative primitive. And so maybe it'll look different in the future, but you could experiment and just build, the parts that you need in your app, and then allow them to be configured so that when I, submit the sign-in form, it's going to check the configuration, see if I have Clerk or Auth0 or WorkOS or whatever. But that would be very interesting. And you could do that for a lot of the components, and you could literally copy a lot of the APIs from Rails and Laravel, and just see what it would look like to like almost use these components and these methods, and like you don't actually have to implement them because they're all going to delegate to services, but there is some the design needed to group them all together. And yeah, I would just like to see more stuff like this in the front end community, that we all just know, okay, we're using Devise, we're Rails, making a Rails app, we need authentication, we're going to install Devise. I would like to see something like that.
This is, I'm kind of understanding from this conversation what your idea, when you think of a framework, what you have in mind, which might not be what I have in mind, might not be what other people have in mind, but I think it's really interesting. So your idea is basically you have a whole bunch of common things. They're all exposed through adapters, and then those adapters know how to talk to each other. So you can enqueue a job that sends an email, and then a test can inspect that job wasn't queued, email was sent, blah, blah, blah. But
Exactly.
it's really, so you have like a shell of adapters.
Exactly.
And then somehow all those, there's like a brain that's like connected to all those adapters that can coordinate things between them.
Yes, exactly right. And, you know, I think this is another point I kind of wanted to just, I was trying to communicate in the talk, and maybe I could have done better, which is cohesion is not, it's not just good because like you get to, you don't have to follow the setup instructions for, you know, Amazon SES. It's not just saving you like an npm install command and, you know, configuring something, because someone could say, oh, I can add resend or ConvertKit to my React app. Actually, there's an npm library that makes it really easy. And so what's the big deal? The thing that cohesion buys you is exactly this, the scenario you described in the beginning with Build UI, where you had to wire up how to send emails from our data layer and preview them and even think about writing tests against them. So one thing that you and I talk a lot about, as you know, in the last, again, 5 years since we've been doing more work with like first front end repo and back end repos separately, and now like full stack in the sense that you can run both front end and back end code in the same repo, like a Remix, like a Next, but still not having the cohesion of a Rails or Laravel. One thing that the way we talk about is that it actually, it moves the complexity from the framework to the connections and wiring between the services. And we see this time and time again. You know, on Build UI, another example, we use HighGraph, which uses caching. It's like an aggressive caching layer for the data it gives. And if you're making like an admin error, you want to update something and see the latest thing, it's not obvious how that all works because they don't know that you're wanting to use it in this certain way. There's a million examples of this, even like hooking up Stripe with like a webhook, hooking up any service. It's not just the install commands that cohesion buys you. Cohesion buys you all of those edge cases, all of the different states that are introduced by having your data and your logic and state spread across different services that don't know about each other. And you run into these all the time. You have to account for them. And there's millions of bugs that live in there that are not getting worked on and improved because they're not part of an open source framework that a community of people is improving, right? Whereas if you make a Rails app and you try to trigger a JavaScript event to enqueue a job and a request comes in and it's blocked, you know, the job server is going to like fail and it's going to retry it. Like all of those kinds of things are getting improved in cohesive frameworks, and they're not when you wire things up together.
That was great. I think you just nailed, I don't think of full stack development as I work on front end and back end. Like I write JavaScript and then I go off and write APIs and I make database queries. That I don't think of that as full stack development. I think of full stack development exactly what you just described. The understanding how all these things come together and the making it as easy as possible. I don't know. Maybe people disagree with that. Maybe like I'm off on my own little island here, but yeah.
You're saying, are you saying like, I'm a front-end developer.
A full stack framework is not a framework that runs JavaScript and makes API requests and writes data to a database. That is not a full stack framework. A full stack framework is a framework that acknowledges that you're going to have an app with jobs and emails and JavaScript and databases, and they try to tie that all together. It's exact this cohesion argument you've been making. But that is what I think of as full stack. If I was hiring a full stack developer, I would want someone to deeply understand that and not just say, oh, I'm a full stack developer. I can write JavaScript and SQL. Like
right.
that is
I've written a function in Node. I've written a function in client JavaScript to like measure a div.
Therefore I'm full stack.
Yeah.
Yeah.
You know, Taylor Otwell, my buddy and the guy who created Laravel and still maintains it, went on a podcast talking about this. And he said, you know, it's fine if you want to say full stack just means like I have a framework that can run code on both endpoints, on both environments. He's like, that's not really interesting to me. He's like, to me, the point of Laravel has always been to enable someone to build a complete app that is going to, yeah, everything they need to build and ship a complete app that does a real thing in the real world. Which again, you need all these components for. And so that to him is always like the motivating principle. And I think it's the same motivating principle for DHH. The reason features get added to Rails is because they support a full end-to-end user flow, feature ability, a capability of a piece of software that needs to exist for the whole thing to work. So in that sense, yes, I totally agree with you that adding in the capability to write an API endpoint is not really, it's like not a lot of it's not going to get the app developer that much farther in building and shipping a product, because yes, now I can write API endpoints to my server, but I'm going to spend so much time wiring them up and thinking about all these intermediate states, and I'm on my own, just like you were on your own setting up mailing and build UI.
That's a great smoke test. Is it's not about how many of these pieces can you add, how much can you npm install, but how quickly can you ship the feature?
Dude,
how free can you ship
100%. In fact,
and also that moves it from this like this BS. I hate that this is BS. Oh, my tech can do this. My tech is flexible, to like actual measurable, like things that actually matter to people that are picking tech. Some people,
yes,
yeah.
Some people, right, want to experiment, and we're not talking about that. We're talking about, dude, it's 100% true. And fastest time to delivering a feature is not just the happy path case, right? It's all of the other cases, because you could install one of these services, hit it as an endpoint, and be like, oh, I'm done, but you're not done. And there's you want to deliver like a working, high quality feature. And those are the kind, again, all those edge cases that we talked about are not going to get covered in the happy path or like the simple use case. It's when you're actually building this complete feature, right? That's so just to clarify that what we mean by complete feature, I think both you and I have in our minds, all the states are covered, and yeah, it's like you don't have to.
Yeah. Is it fair to say in like your vision of this that the only way to get there is with this cohesion?
That's why I think that the radix argument, the existence of radix is not does not falsify the value of a cohesive backend, of a cohesive framework. So just because radix and headless UI components solve the problem of how do we share behavior without forcing everyone to use a radix framework, which is amazing.
Yes.
It doesn't mean that all problems, that doesn't solve a lot of other problems. That's one piece of the puzzle. But even if every piece of the puzzle was at that layer, like, even like animating radix with framer motion, it's amazing that you can do that. But if you have to learn that for every, again, there's like a combinatorial problem here when you add background jobs, emails, database, and all the ways that they talk to each other. And I think that is why tools like Shad are even popular, because you need someone with taste and opinions to bring these things together. And how cool would it be if you know Shad and you come into an app at your new job and they use Shad, so you are familiar with the interfaces that he's decided to expose, right? That's the same argument here, but for every piece of the puzzle. And the point being that people need to be, the more of these interfaces that are shared and worked on and battle tested in the context of open source and many different companies, the better they get. But nobody is doing that work right now in front end. Let me read this tweet that we were talking about Laravel. It's this guy, he makes courses, I guess, for Laravel. His name is Pavlos Korup. And he says this, and it reminded me a lot of our Rails days. He says, I realized why design patterns are hard to understand and practice with Laravel. Patterns are mostly about OOP and creating classes and interfaces with some repeating logic. In Laravel, the framework itself already abstracts almost all interactions with interfaces in OOP for us. How often do you manually need to create a new ABC class in Laravel? You mostly just need to use them, right? user where get, store request, return redirect. And if you need separate classes or drivers, like sending Slack or email, you can configure them, with .env or config, type hinting which classes to use, notification is to email, to SMS, whatever. As a result, developers mostly don't need to actively create classes and even more rarely have to think about any design patterns because almost all patterns are already inside the framework. We just need to use them. Thank you, Taylor. And then he has an image of this soldier defending a person sleeping, and the soldier is Taylor. And all the knives coming in are the design patterns. And the person sleeping is a dev who just delivered a project with Laravel. And then there's this great follow-up tweet from this girl, Mary. She said, I've been studying design patterns in depth for a few months to put together a talk about patterns in Laravel. And this has been my most important takeaway. It started to click for me in the Gang of Four Design Pattern book's chapter on factories, where frameworks are described as a good use case because decoupling is so important for framework design. Then a friend of mine told me his opinion that devs who go through design patterns tend to overuse them for a bit and write bad code. As I went through the patterns in source code, I started to notice which patterns are heavily used and which aren't. At that point, I developed a healthy respect for the choices made in Laravel. They complement the language, complement each other, and form a coherent structure. I hear all the time that Laravel source code is beautiful, not as much that the choice of patterns and their implementation is beautiful. This may be a chicken and egg situation. My conclusion is that devs using a framework can enrich their understanding and experience by learning patterns and understanding how a framework uses them, but the goal should almost always be to gracefully extend the existing structure rather than force code into a structure. Creating a framework, on the other hand, requires not only good handle of architecture, but also a fair amount of taste. Now I read the paradigm of programming towards interfaces in Laravel as a terse expression of the class structure already existing and not requiring, in most cases, additional classes. But now I read it in terms of design patterns as well, and with a deeper understanding of contracts and interfaces. Laravel really does use some beautiful concepts very well. Seeing the implementation has taught me a lot. TLDR, I totally agree. So I thought this was such an awesome response. Both of these tweets were really cool, but I loved Mary's framing here. And in particular, when she says, Taylor had to deeply learn difficult things about architecture and these design patterns that are appropriate at this very high level of abstraction. And he made good choices that respect the language and complement what patterns PHP developers use. So, but he's working on that. It's the in-between. It's like the middleware, right? It's like there's this middleware layer. It's like software.
Framework.
It's a framework. Exactly. But it's like, middleware is like software about software. That's what this is. And if you don't have that outside your code, you're going to have it inside your code. It's a different level of abstraction than business logic. And you're going to be doing it while you're going to be jumping up and down this abstraction ladder while you're trying to build features, but also write the software about the software. And that, I think, again, if folks haven't used a framework like Rails or Laravel, I think it's easy to underestimate how complex this layer is, how many edge cases, how many bugs can exist here, and but how important it is, and how much a good framework can let you never think about this stuff at all. So I thought that was really good. I'm sweating in here because I'm getting all worked up, but it's also summer here and I got the window closed. But I think that, most of the frameworks, according to this kind of definition that we've been throwing around, don't exist in React. In fact, I would say, I know that like Adonis exists and Redwood. I haven't used them a lot lately or ever, but I haven't looked at them recently. And I think they have more of this stuff. They have, again, the software about the software that is being worked on and shared. Mm-hmm. But this point about how Taylor's choices in Laravel complemented the strengths of PHP, I think a framework in React should complement the patterns that React developers use.
The strengths of React.
The strengths of React,
that just nails those composition components.
Exactly. So all that to say, I'm interested to see more opinionated React frameworks or React frameworks just in general. And that's really what I meant by this part of my talk. What does a cohesive React framework look like? I don't think it's going to look like Rails in JavaScript, which is something we've talked about in the past. Why is there no Rails in JavaScript? And maybe it's because when people try to do Rails in JavaScript, they were copying the patterns and Rails, the strengths of Ruby, the strengths of PHP, and maybe the strengths of React aren't the same. Well, we know they're not, but maybe they're so different that they just didn't feel good for React developers. Whereas if you give them a framework that complements it, people are going to not wait to use it, you know?
Yeah, it feels like you're writing. It feels like you're writing React. It feels like you're using a tool like Radix.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it's very, very interesting.
Yeah.
Just going back to something I've been just harping on for over the past year, but you can totally see how RSCs and server actions are just that beeline right to the story that you're talking about. So
it's true.
Very, very exciting.
It's super exciting to me. You say, how do I render a tweet in React? And I can install React Tweet, give it an ID, and somehow it just takes care of all of it. It loads the data. It lets me customize it. I don't hit a ceiling, but it takes care of all that ugly stuff. I don't have to make an API endpoint and think what happened, you know? You can imagine things like that existing. So that is absolutely the part about RSC that I am most excited about. And I hope that RSCs land well and are taken up once React 19 releases. And I hope that we see a lot of experimentation with RSC frameworks, because I don't think it's obvious today what the Rails or Laravel of React is going to look like. I don't think it's going to look similar, because I don't think we'll be able to predict it, because it's just a different way of thinking, you know?
Yeah. Also too, it should be, this is like a philosophical view of mine, but I believe these things should be emergent and not, top down. So
yes, and extracted ideally from like successful real world apps. I know we're going long, but I just want to say one thing before I forget. I think what you said is really awesome, which was, if you use a tool that lets you write code that can run in the browser and code that can run in the server, that's not like an interesting definition of full stack to me. What's an interesting definition to full stack to me is you give me tools that make it easy to build a complete feature that I would need for my product or my website. And for features that span both the browser and the server, right? I actually think it's almost, you can even squint and blur a little bit more and say, like, I shouldn't even care about where they run. If I drag a table from Microsoft Visual, what was Visual
Front
Basic?
page. Front page.
Visual Basic. There was some
Basic,
like
okay.
forms. There were some forms, Windows Forms component, WinForms. I did this like way back in the day. You have like a toolbar of UI components, and you can drag a table, and you can say this is like users. You give it a title of users, and I can start making data, and it saves it, and the data and the table is like sortable and reorganizable, and you just built a feature because I wanted a table of like family members, and I was able to do that very easily. That's like full stack. I actually don't care where the code is running. In fact, thinking about servers and clients is a pretty low level of abstraction. If you think about it, if you were talking to a product person at your company, they don't care about where the code is running. That's
100%.
not the point.
They're 100%.
So you could imagine, and again, this is something else why I get excited about RSCs, because part of the whole like vision is that you need to be able to create blog posts and then list them and then show them in like order by published at or popular. You could imagine React server components that do that without you ever thinking about whether this is a server component, a client component. And I think that's kind of the goal, because that would be a full stack framework, right? Even if like it's full stack because I didn't have to think about it. You know what I mean? It's like It's full stack because because the framework is giving me all of that code about the code, the discussions between the software pieces, and it's enabling me to build my thing, faster. So
Ryan Florence says dissolve away the network.
yes,
And so I think you can kind of twist that and say
yes,
something like, if my framework, if my tool dissolves away the network, then that means I should be able to build features, build actual, like something I can push to prod, something I can deliver. And at that top level of like what's going through my head, the network doesn't exist.
right,
Of course, I know about the network. It exists
right,
like later down that stack, but at the top level.
yep,
I know we ran a little long. Can we just, I just want to sum up this conversation because I think
yes.
we went through a lot of different things. So it started off where having libraries that are easy to install, that are easy to configure is not like the main benefit of frameworks. The main benefit of frameworks is this idea of like this cohesion. This exists through something like the adapter pattern, but something like you have a job server, a test runner, and an email system, and they all know about each other. The framework has like a brain into all of those. There's also this frameworks work best by playing to their strengths of the environment they're running in. So a React framework won't look like Rails. It'll look like something Reacty, something like Radixy, something composition. We're wiring a bunch of components together.
Elixir and Phoenix is a good example. It embraces the patterns of Elixir, the Phoenix language. It doesn't look like Rails in a lot of places, even though it is a framework because it enables people to build features without worrying about that glue, that software glue.
Interesting. And then this is where the taste factor really comes in, because it's not just about copying, it's about playing to those strengths. And so you need the taste really exists on two sides. The taste on one side is, how do I architect this framework in such a way that these components can easily communicate with each other so that the developer can do things easy, like write a test that the email was sent. The taste also exists on the other side. I guess like we sometimes refer to this as API design, but the taste exists for the developer the framework author. Taste matters because they are creating a framework that plays to the strengths of the tool the developer is using.
Exactly. Exactly. And just like in Rails, they added things like order by, because it's a common SQL operation that you want to use to order your blog post by popular or latest. But that was added to the adapter, to the active model interface, or like a default scope, right? That's an idea as well. The way that's where taste comes in, right? And the way that would look in like Ryan Florence's demo is like, how do you render a table from this framework, and how do I feed it data and tell it to sort and bring in different libraries if I need to? All of those things are customizable, which is in fact the content, the subject of our upcoming course on Build UI, which is about all of the patterns that the React community has learned to make components that are powerful and still flexible. Things that like the patterns you see Radix uses. But yes, the taste comes in the glue, and the glue still needs to exist. In Ryan's talk, Mind the Gap, it's true. React server components dissolve the network, but that's an amazing thing. But if you gave me a React server component framework, a build system that let me write RSCs and server actions, it's true. I can just use client and use server and not think about the network. But I still don't have a framework because that's low level.
Right.
That will enable higher level components that we can then use to snap together apps. But you still need someone to build the glue. And the glue in a React framework is going to look different than the glue that is in Rails, than the glue that is in Laravel, and the glues in Phoenix. The glue in the React framework, we don't know what it's going to look like, but someone needs to be working on it. And the more that people put out ideas for what the compounds that the glue should, okay, I'm stretching this analogy, the more that people can work on that stuff, and the more that people like you don't have to start from scratch when they think, how am I going to preview an email and send it? Because there's somebody working on again, the software about the software, the in between. So that's where the taste comes in, and that's where we can look to other frameworks for inspiration and also extract from our own real world work. But there is so much more glue that can be shared than is being shared right now, which is basically nothing. An API call is not shared code. I mean, it's like we can do so much better. And again, if you watch my talk and you look at the slide for how you write a test in Rails that does all these things, and then I ask you to pull up your React app and show me how you would do it, you're never going to win that. I promise you, you're not going to win that argument. So
well, I guarantee you I can do it in less lines of code in React. Can't beat 0 lines of code.
Whatever, even if you don't care about testing any of these things. Anyway, so that's what I wanted to get at. That's good. Get all that. It's kind of been brewing in my head since that talk. We've had a couple talks about it, so I'm glad we got to just get all those ideas out there.
I love that it's not services versus frameworks.
Yes.
This conversation, there's room for both.
Yes.
And it's not one or the other.
Yes.
And I really like that.
Yes. And I do too, because for a long time I thought it was either or. Either you use Stripe to do checkout, or you get, a mailer adapter, and that means DHH has to do it. And DHH is not going to add, or the Rails community is not going to add a charger adapter, because that means PCI compliance and all this stuff. So, that makes it harder to test Stripe compared to testing any other component that's part of Rails. But you get a benefit because the Stripe checkout page is going to be updated. It's not code you maintain. It doesn't have bugs that you have to update your patches for. So it feels like, buy versus build. And there's this fundamental tension, but it's not. There's spots in the middle where you can build the shared glue, but you can buy the actual implementation. So yeah.
Okay, cool. That was awesome.
Sweet. All right. That was fun. If you have any thoughts, give us your feedback, comments on our YouTube. Hit us up at Frontend First FM on Twitter. And we want to start asking if people want to send emails with thoughts or suggestions. I know not everyone's on Twitter, not everyone's on YouTube. So for now, just send an email to support@buildui.com if you have anything you want us to talk about or any questions.
Yeah. Also, or just Ryan@buildui or Sam@buildui.com.
Yep, either
those
one.
are our personal email addresses, and definitely hit us up. We love hearing from listeners.
Absolutely. Sweet, man. Let's wrap it up there. That was fun.
Cool.
All right. Thanks for listening, everyone, and we'll see you next week. Bye-bye.
See ya.